So my topic is based, as Mrs. Vortruba told, on this publication and climate change and mental health of children. And actually, when we made this presentation from our colleagues across the world, we saw a few things. But to introduce to the topic, I would like to start with that climate change has become a global emergency worldwide. And when we see this topic and when we focus on that, we see that actually it is all across the areas of our life, whether we take financial, economical, social, or individual areas. And we cannot avoid talking about this, and we see it actually worldwide. And according to the World Health Organization, climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the next 50 years. So it is a dire need to gain an importance in our psychiatric community to this topic. When we try to see who is at risk of climate change, we actually can see that there are some different specific areas and some vulnerable groups who are particularly vulnerable. For example, those living in poverty, as well as women, children, and the elderly are ones who are very vulnerable, especially in low and middle income countries. Also the outdoor workers and people living with chronic mental conditions, as well as children are the most vulnerable groups because due to long exposure to environmental risks, when we take also the perinatal period to the childhood and across the adolescence, we are extremely vulnerable to the climate change issues. And also those living in megacities, small island, developing states, and other coastal, mountainous, and polar regions are also affected. So also, if I mentioned low and middle income countries, we cannot exclude also those living in high income countries, as we see the climate change effects across the world. And also, countries with weak health systems will be least able to prepare and respond further on, as we are seeing already in these areas particularly affected. And for example, in China or India, there are enormous impact on that preparation, and without any good preparation, we actually cannot have a good response. Here is a very nice systematic review from colleagues from United States made a few years ago, which we can see a causal process for mental health effects. And this one is for the drought. And if we see the drought, we actually, when the drought is happening, we see those effects like declined agricultural production, crop failure, and livestock loss. It also impacts increased workloads, or otherwise the loss of workloads, the changes in workloads, in employment, in social interactions, and in social environments. And then we see lots of errors and lots of things that are connected to each other. But basically, where are we heading to is actually those all effects are causing mental health problems like loss of social networks, social or geographic isolation, leading to the problems like domestic violence, abuse, anxiety or anxious symptoms, and even go to those long-lasting problems with consequences, serious consequences for mental health issues like suicides, very severe depression states, and also this whole system is not cannot be distinguished or separated from our physical health. And as we all know, physical health is connected to mental health. So when we are talking about the effects of climate change to the mental health, we always have to see the bigger picture, not only to physical health, but mental health. And actually only when we will be able to see it as a whole, as a holistic view, we can ensure the best prevention. I already mentioned some things about vulnerable populations. Once again, I would like to pay a little bit more attention to children and adolescents, especially those in low-income countries and minority communities. And of course, what we are seeing, and we are seeing lots of studies, also our study and our publication, which we compared data from 15 countries, we saw that actually, even though the countries are quite different, the regions are quite different, but if you take the regions in Asia and the regions in Latin America, the problems are quite universal, because we have marginalized sectors of society which face deeply rooted structural interconnecting challenges such as poor air quality and higher risk of suffering climate disasters. For example, if we're talking about poor quality, the effects of climate change, we are starting very early, even though in perinatal period, when the pregnant women are facing poor air quality systems or poor air quality areas, and we cannot actually avoid them when being in some indoor places. So the problem is very complex when we are thinking how this could affect our health. And also existing disparities in children's health due to poverty and systematic racism. Systematic racism is also a very big and separate topic. We also try to publish our data on systematic racism, which is now in the process. But of course, there are some things that are very vulnerable on this specific topic, and there are some great differences across the world when we take systemic racism and when we also try to connect it to the climate change. So actually, the data we published concentrated on the previous studies and also on the current data from different countries. So we distinguished direct effects, indirect effects, and effects on mental health through physical conditions. So when we are talking about the direct effects of climate change, they are manifested as mental health conditions. We actually, in many studies, we see that there is a significant prevalence of pre-traumatic as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. Even though we know a lot as a psychiatry community about post-traumatic stress disorder, the pre-traumatic stress disorder, which is until now not classified as a disorder, such a classical way as post-traumatic stress disorder, should also be considered as one of the biggest mental health issues when we are considering climate change, because the symptoms that the people are experiencing in the places of disasters happening, when the disaster is still evolving. For example, in India, when we are announced that after a week there's going to be a big drought and you're not going to have no family or no house at all because the drought is going to be so big and affect your whole city. So the symptoms actually of pre-traumatic stress disorder that the people in these areas could affect before the drought, knowing that the drought is coming, are quite similar to those post-traumatic stress disorder, which is actually could be diagnosed only 6 months after the particular event or disaster. So this is also very interesting topic, which should gain a lot of more attention, especially in vulnerable populations. Also, the increase of major depressive disorder is also an issue for those not only affected populations, but also for people, especially migrating from the affected areas to the ones who are more suitable to live. And one big topic is also anxiety disorders, which we see specific prevalence there in affected areas, but also for people who already migrated, and also the new terms in this field like eco-anxiety and solastalgia, when the people is longing for the home, which he knows is not going to be there anymore because it is physically not there because of a catastrophic event, also have to be considered. And warmer weathers are likely to increase aggressive behaviors, while droughts can result in increased levels of stress. And when we take vulnerable populations and most affected areas, we see after a few months, after a specific period of time, the increase of alcohol and drug disorders and abuse even after a few months, because the people try to compensate their behaviors, because the problem is the social environments who are already affected are not there anymore. For example, if people used to go somewhere or do somewhere, but because of the changed environment, we are not more able to, because it's not there anymore. So we have to compensate somehow, and sometimes we tend to compensate with risky behaviors. When we're talking about indirect effects on mental health, we see lots of different reasons, like due to political turmoil. War is not only also not an exception, but we are seeing the actual political turmoil in particularly our region. Also forced migration, marital discord, property destruction, and my already mentioned risky behaviors such as alcohol abuse. These all effects are very complex and should be considered when we are talking about climate change issues, because the one problem which actually is considered as environmental problem is even more complex and shows us significantly that there is more than a nature issue. And when we take the effects on mental health through physical conditions, which is actually very good data, not only in recent years, but already in our decades, we see that, of course, there are lots of impacts of climate change, which I already mentioned some of them, especially in perinatal psychiatry, mentioning that air pollution. But we also see that actually when we take general populations, for example, hot weather, health hazards caused by heat waves. Yesterday, is a wonderful study from United States colleagues that we made in Arizona, and we stated that even though the increasement of air temperature in 2 degrees causes an enormous impact for the mental health and for the emotional state of the people, even though we do not see that in a big scale, like mental health disorders, the increase of them. But for the emotional well-being, the hot temperature or the steady increase of it plays a crucial role. Also increase in precipitation, like problems with water quality, waterborne disease outbreaks, and moisture damage in building, slippery conditions, slip and fall accidents, darker winters, depression and darker winters, like winter depression is well-known effect, extreme weather phenomena, and global warming, of course, itself causing vector-borne infectious diseases because of biodiversity changes and environmental changes. Also, very important thing to consider is triple burden of malnutrition, overnutrition, undernutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies, starting from very early childhood, going to the whole development, as we know, as like neuronal development is going through adolescent into young adulthood. This is also the aspects very important to consider. And this burden is seen in some of the world areas most affected due to desertification and catastrophic events. And possibly contributed to vulnerability, fatigue, severe mood changes, and decline in cognitive functioning in the populations, in general populations, not only in vulnerable groups or mental health affected people. And also a few words about recent situation and war and climate change. And even though we are recently asking what does it have to do in common, but as I already mentioned, war also changes the environments in that way that I could just show a few examples, like militaries consuming enormous amounts of fossil fuels, which is of course warming the environments and changing climate in this way. Also bombings directly harm wildlife and biodiversity, changing absolutely where people used to live. A recent study published in Alaska showed the data that those communities who used to use dogs, huskies, to go somewhere from one small city to another using sledges cannot do this anymore because the ice is not there anymore. So we have to change their behavior somehow, and it's also causing lots of problems considering mental health. Tattered families, deceased children, refugees, the crisis we are seeing in Europe, particularly also in Western Europe. Actually, the years in these decades we could also see because of the different conflicts going, and other things, you name it, everything is also affecting climate change in many ways. And of course, people are not the only one who are suffering. We shouldn't always not forget that we are not alone. And this is a picture that particularly made me sad because the destruction of Arctic ecosystems forces animals to search for food on land, such as these polar bears in northern Russia. Sadly, but this also could be very, very sad and future of ours, as well as some regions of the world will not be able to get a proper food and proper nutrition. Yes, so we also have to consider the nature as well, not only ourselves. But to have a more positive news as well, we have this initiative in World Psychiatric Association Global Climate Change Initiative, and me myself with some other colleagues across the world. Our group is led by Professor Sorel, a renowned psychiatrist from Washington University. We are trying to put some initiatives together and to look to international data and to do some work in prevention and in gaining more attention to this topic. And we now focus on education and research in mental health and climate change. So actually, the integration of climate psychiatry in global research agendas, as well as promoting studies on pregnancy and perinatal mental health, starting from very, very early period of life, especially in areas most affected by climate change, is our topic. Also, integration of climate psychiatry curricula into psychiatric undergraduate and postgraduate education programs. As I don't know if you have heard some, but I, in my medical studies, I was not able to do any course on climate psychiatry, and right now I know there are some in the United States, but it's very some of them, and nothing very structural. Also developing guidelines for the diagnosis and management of mental health conditions after climate catastrophes are particularly important when we consider this topic. So that's briefly about our work now. These are my resources, and thank you for your attention. I will be happy to discuss with you this topic.